Hello and welcome to a lesson with elaboration, iterations, and new information with respect to intellectual empathy. So you will recall that you were introduced to intellectual empathy as one of 4 intellectual virtues that you learned about during a previous unit or lesson. Some of what we go over in the slide will repeat some of what you learned before, but there will also be a lot of new information either in writing or verbally. Make sure that you're using the study questions that I will have given you below the link to this slide so that you can have the insights that you need to show that you did the learning by engaging with the video in a future graded task. That said, let's go ahead and start with a little bit of review, making sure to take good notes and answer those study questions. Remember that the cool thing about a video is that you can pause and rewind me as much as you need. All right, so let's do a little review. From now on in this course, this is going to be our official definition for intellectual empathy. You might have a slightly different version of this definition, but this is one that I've come up with recently that I prefer to use. And it is the disposition and ability to imaginatively put oneself in the thinking place of others so as to genuinely understand their conceptual frameworks and or reasoning. This definition shows that there are at least 2 dimensions when it comes to manifesting or reflecting intellectual empathy. Dimension 1 is seeing how others use some beliefs to justify others. That should make you think of what you've learned about argument in this class and logic. Dimension 2 has to do with identifying and discerning the concepts of others so as to understand their conceptual structures and how they hang together. Now, a major mistake that some students and learners of intellectual empathy make is thinking that it's about understanding somebody's feelings and emotions. But this is not about emotional empathy. As you can see in the definition, it says the thinking place of others. It says understanding conceptual frameworks or reasoning. So this is not about understanding people's feelings or emotions. That would be more of a kind of emotional or social empathy, perhaps. Another mistake that people make with respect to intellectual empathy is that they think that it is shown only if, in fact, they do accept or agree with the view that they're trying to understand. And that's not true. You show intellectual empathy in spite of your agreement or disagreement with somebody's views. Again, let's stick to the definition. Did you try to imaginatively put yourself in the thinking place of others? If you did that, as articulated here and as iterated and clarified a few seconds ago, then it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with what you tried to understand. The point is that you tried to understand things from somebody else's thinking place, so to speak. And in fact, if you think about it, you can't even know whether you agree or disagree really unless you've expressed intellectual empathy. So seeing how others use some beliefs to justify others, seeing how others define their concepts and how their concepts hang together, doing that is necessary in order to know whether you agree or disagree with someone. All right, so now let's move on to significance. We cannot claim to have given someone a fair hearing if we have not made a good effort to acquire a clear, accurate, precise understanding of how he or she thinks. All right, so another thing that I want to call your attention to is something that I feel very passionate about, and that is that you probably heard the saying, you haven't walked a mile in my shoes, so who are you to judge, or something like that. Well, that might be true. So when people often, I'm going to actually turn the camera around. Give me a second. So, you've heard that saying, like, who are you to judge? You haven't walked a mile in my shoes, or try walking a mile in my shoes. Usually people use that in the context of maybe they've made choices or decisions or engaged in behavior or actions that maybe other people are judging them, for. And when somebody says, well, have you walked a mile in the shoes, or you haven't walked in my shoes, they mean that you haven't seen maybe why I've done what I've done, the decisions that I make. So something similar is happening here when we're trying to understand what it means to express intellectual empathy. The idea is that before you before we can say that it's fair for you to judge, to evaluate somebody's position, point of view, concepts, conceptual structure, point of view, argument, or logic, you have to try to walk within their thinking shoes. And the way that you try to walk a mile or a sentence or a claim or a paragraph in someone's thinking, intellectual, conceptual, logical argument shoes is by practicing and manifesting intellectual empathy. Something that I'm really passionate about is that, in my opinion, in my informed opinion, in studying the intellectual virtues and morality, is that we really have no business judging somebody's argument or point of view if we haven't made a genuine effort to gain a clear, accurate, and precise understanding of why they believe what they believe. Okay, when it comes to argument and logic, why they use certain concepts the way that they do, why they think a certain concept or definition applies or whatnot. So that's something that I feel very strongly about. And that actually, if I look down, it's because I'm just looking at some notes to make sure that I do not forget anything. So that actually connects to some points of elaboration I want to make. But first, let me make sure I've covered the last bullet point first. Must be mindful of biases and prejudices. And I have a missing word here, that can impede one's ability to really get into someone else's thinking. All right, so I just talked about, that we really need to give out of respect to other people and who they are as persons, as rational beings who can think and reason. Out of respect, we have to make sure that we make a genuine attempt to understand where they're coming from. But in doing that, we need to be mindful of biases and prejudices that we have that might be used to unfairly or prematurely reject or filter in some unflattering, uncharitable way what it is that the person actually thinks. Again, whether it be conceptual or logical in terms of arguments. And right now, I'm not using the term logical as in valid or strong or good reasoning. All I mean by logical is that, do they try to give some premises in support of a conclusion? They might not do a good job supporting their conclusion with the premises. The premises might not be adequate. They might not be relevant, but there is a logic. So there's good logic, there's bad logic. But do you at least try to understand their logic, okay? In fact, you can't even judge somebody's logic until you try to understand it. So you can't say, oh, well, that's a good logic in your argument, or that's a bad argument, or your logic's not solid, unless you've really tried to give them a fair hearing in terms of what they do present as premises for their conclusion. So it's very mindful, going back to what I was saying about prejudices and biases, to be aware that we all have prejudices and biases of some sort, and they're not just about race or ethnicity. So that's really important to understand here. When I say biases and prejudices, we can have them about generations, right? I'm Generation X. Have you guys heard about us? What do you think about my generation? What are some biases or assumptions or presuppositions about Generation X that you know about? I think you guys are Generation Z, and of course I have certain ideas about Generation Z based on my interaction with Generation Z. My children are millennials. My mother's a baby boomer. So it's very interesting to think about that. But we can also have biases and prejudices that are religious in nature, political in nature, social in nature, culture in nature, those that have to do with economic status like class and whatnot. So we need to watch out for those ego and sociocentric biases and prejudices that can be used as filters or deflectors in trying to understand where somebody's coming from with respect to their thinking, Again, whether it be their conceptual frameworks, how they define the concepts and what they think count as correct and incorrect examples, and of course, any arguments or reasoning they try to provide, whether it's for the definition of a concept, the application of a concept, or just some kind of claim like, is it possible to prove that any claims about the coronavirus are true? Okay, so now what I want to focus on is how intellectual empathy is going to connect specifically, in fact, has already played a role in how you do in this course, just in virtue of completing Unit 1 and in your efforts to complete Unit 2, and then, of course, your future efforts to complete Units 3 and 4. You're going to need intellectual empathy to really understand what it is that this course is about. So as you guys know, the name of this course is Philosophy 1301, okay? So that's what I call the discipline. So that's the first thing I want you to know about any connections that I want to be explicit about with respect to intellectual empathy and this course, okay? First point, intellectual empathy is an absolute must for understanding the discipline of philosophy, for understanding this discipline. And in fact, you need intellectual empathy to really get into the thinking of a given discipline. In this class, you're using intellectual empathy to learn to think through arguments like a philosopher, whether they're arguments about knowledge and epistemology or metaphysics and free will, and in the future, morality, right, wrong, good and evil, okay? Whether it's about using intellectual empathy to understand how does a discipline, what are the core concepts of a discipline? What are some of the definitions for those core concepts in that discipline? What are some of the core questions, the central questions that the discipline is working on that they think are important? And why does the discipline think that those are important questions? Okay, when you're asking those questions and thinking about those things, then you're making an attempt to express intellectual empathy. So we can express intellectual empathy at the level of the discipline. And so you're definitely trying to do that, I hope, by reflecting intellectual empathy and the character traits that go with that as you're learning about philosophy. Okay, so that said, you also need intellectual empathy to understand the different branches that we're covering. Okay, so what does it mean to think like epistemologist, to think through the branch of epistemology? What are the core concepts in epistemology? What are some of the central questions and concerns and puzzles? So again, a branch. So we can think of intellectual empathy not only at a discipline level, but also at the level of subdivision fields or branches. So I like to use the word branches to talk about like a second level or second tier of how we need intellectual empathy and can use intellectual empathy specific to this class. So the branches, that would be the next level. And of course, the specific branches are, I've already mentioned them, but I'll mention them again. Epistemology. What does it mean? What does it look like to really try to get into the thinking place, to go back to our definition for intellectual empathy, of an epistemologist in the branch of epistemology? What does it look like? How is making a genuine effort to get into the thinking place of a metaphysician in the branch of metaphysics, how is that going to really help me to really understand why, the metaphysicians have developed the concepts that they do and the questions that they have about, reality or free will or identity, okay? And then again, the same thing that's coming up for, that will be part of Unit 4 probably, and that is ethics, right? What does it mean to think like a philosopher about ethics? What does it mean to think philosophically about ethics, about right and wrong? What are some of the concepts, the theories, the divisions, the questions, the problems that philosophers of ethics, ethicists, right, have come up with? So you've got the discipline level at which you can try to apply intellectual empathy, the level of the branch, right? And so epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. So sometimes, unfortunately, what some students will do is that they'll decide beforehand that a class is going to be irrelevant, pointless, it's not going to have anything to offer them, which of course is not reflecting intellectual humility, because you don't know if something's going to be beneficial to you unless you've actually studied it and tried to get to know what it is, right? You're making a judgment based on nothing, biases, prejudices, or just imagining, making stuff up. So then if you do have intellectual empathy and you're open-minded to what philosophy or any other course has to offer, then what you need to make sure you're manifesting is intellectual empathy, watching out for those biases and prejudices, trying to keep an open mind that the discipline, in this class philosophy, might have something to offer, but you won't know whether it has something to offer, whether it can be relevant to who you are and your self-understanding and your critical thinking skills, unless you actually experience it. And to experience it properly, you have to put yourself, make a genuine, legitimate, for real effort to get into the thinking place of the philosopher, to really engage. So what will not help is just working through the curriculum just like it's busy work or a coop, right? So those are important things to keep in mind. Now, intellectual empathy is also needed to understand, of course, not only a discipline, not only the branches of a discipline, okay, and I already reminded you the name of the three branches, but also the the theories and the thinkers and philosophers who have come up with the theories within a given philosophical branch, right? So, for example, when you were working your way through Unit 2, you were learning to think like an epistemologist. That's the branch level, right? You're trying to get into the thinking place of an epistemologist to see why they're so concerned about knowledge and how they've argued for it and how the different concepts they've defined and how those definitions influence their arguments and their thinking. And the thing is that, you know, to understand that the best, you had to make sure, in terms of how Lawhead presents it, you had to make sure that you made a genuine effort to put yourself in the thinking place of the different theories. So, for example, you had to learn about skepticism, rationalism, and empiricism. Those are the three branches that we focused on after the introductory section to Chapter 3 in Unit 1. You were introduced to 2 or 3 other theories about knowledge, but after you got that initial introduction, I then had you focus only on 3 theories. Now, I want you to think about this. Each of those theories, right, had something to say about knowledge. Skepticism disagreed with all the other theories. And then rationalism and empiricism had at least one thing in common. They think knowledge is possible, but in different ways, right? So they definitely have a disagreement. So in order to really develop a genuine understanding of each theory, especially since they had disagreements with each other, you had to, each time you were reading a theory, try to clear your mind of your own epistemological ideas about how and whether we can know something, your own biases about whether it's even important to think about knowledge, in order to understand each theory in and of itself, right? So yeah, you read about skepticism and you needed intellectual empathy to really get into the thinking place of the skeptic, but then you needed to kind of put that understanding on hold and then look at rationalism while trying to filter out what you learned about skepticism, because you didn't want your new knowledge of skepticism to get in the way as a filter or a rejecting device in terms of understanding rationalism. And of course, I can go on talking about empiricism. Now, when it comes to the unit 3, or a unit that focuses on metaphysics and free will, whatever unit that happens to be for whoever's listening to this video at this particular semester, of course, you're now going to be optimizing your learning experience and genuine understanding of philosophy in terms of metaphysics. So this is all about trying to understand, why does a metaphysician think the stuff they talk about is so important? So during Unit 3, you will have gotten the basic ideas in the introductory section, trying to get into the thinking place of the metaphysicians, why and how they raise certain questions and think about certain things the way that they do generally. But then again, you had to then go to a different level. So we'll say that there's a discipline level of intellectual empathy. You dig deeper into each branch, a branch level of intellectual empathy, and then a theoretical level. So again, in this unit then, you needed to practice intellectual empathy to develop a clear, accurate, and precise understanding of the different theories of, there's metaphysical determinism. That's what I call it. Okay, so that's just a theory about causality, and I'll lecture about that in the test 2 prep videos because I need to clarify something Lawhead says. Then there's the theory about free will and responsibility called hard determinism, okay, which accepts metaphysical determinism. Then you had the theory on libertarianism, okay, which is a metaphysical theory about free will and rejects metaphysical determinism. And then you had the theory of what Lawhead calls compatibilism, but I prefer to call soft determinism, which accepts metaphysical determinism, but rejects things that both the libertarian and the hard determinists say. Now, your ability to gain a clear, accurate, and precise understanding of each of those theories in a way that is true and accurate with respect to each theory requires intellectual empathy. Each time you learned a theory or were learning about a theory, you had to watch out for your biases and prejudices when it comes to your own metaphysics and beliefs about free will, or what you had learned about a previous theory of free will that you had already covered, to try to truly engage and understand that theory on its own terms. So again, and I think I kind of lost track of a point that I was making earlier, is that in order to say that a discipline or philosophy does or does not have anything to offer, in order to say that a particular branch or the thinkers or the philosophers or the theories will be irrelevant or useless, before you can say that in any meaningful sense or in a fair sense, you first have to make a genuine effort to engage in the thinking place that you should find yourself in when you're imaginatively, genuinely putting yourself in the lessons and the thinking of a discipline, okay, of a branch or a field of a discipline, or with respect to a particular theory. Okay, so the last point I want to make is that you definitely needed intellectual empathy when it came to the task, a task that you should have done for a previous unit, and that is question generation and contextualization, because you had to read a peer response. And in order to do that well, you had to make sure that you understood them clearly, precisely, and that in contextualizing and generating a question, that you did not misrepresent or distort what they had said, right? You couldn't take a claim that they made and took it out of context, because that would result in, one, saying something inaccurate about them and their thinking, and or your question could turn out to be pointless or irrelevant, right? So intellectual empathy is definitely required to do that kind of writing activity, because you have to make sure that you have imaginatively put yourself in the place of that peer, their thinking place, their intellectual place, their reasoning, their logic, their concepts, and whatnot. Only then would your question generalization and contextualization be fair, representative, accurate, and whatnot. And one assignment that is the final assignment that you do at the end of the semester, the objective analysis, in that one, you're not going to do any question generalization or contextualization. Rather, you're going to compare one of your arguments with a peer. So that shows you that you're definitely going to need intellectual empathy. So you're going to find a point of contrast or comparison, or maybe I'll have you do both, and then you'll have to write a paragraph on how what you said in your arguments, how that compares and or contrast with what you actually said in text